Let's take the front piece first. Measure out enough tracing paper to cut not only the right side, but the left side as well of the center front piece. In other words, instead of having a half front, we're going to have a full front piece. So right now I'm just making sure there's enough paper underneath the pattern to pin it down and add seam allowance. This top will have a shaped hem. Shaped hems need to have facings. So after I have fitted the muslin top to the model and determined the exact fit, made any pattern corrections, I will go back and make a pattern for the shaped hem facing. Fold the paper in half, making sure there's plenty of room on the outside of the pattern for your seam allowance. And then pin the pattern securely down. I will need a very small seam allowance at the bottom of this top. Now with a ruler, add seam allowance. Right here I'm adding 3/4 of an inch. This little part is the armhole. I'm adding only 1/4 of an inch around the armhole. Armholes and necklines are easily sewn when there's small seam allowance, if there's a curve, and armholes and necklines are always curves. Almost always. There's a slight curve at the waist, so I'm using my curved tool. Where the 3/4 inch seam allowance meets the 1/4 inch seam allowance, you'll see there's a little right angle. There's a right angle at center front, adding 1/4 seam allowance around the neckline. checking to see that there's a 1/4 inch at the bottom for seam allowance. Right here, I'm just writing in the amount that the seam allowance is, 3/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, etc. Now these are the notches. You remember those long lines that I had put on the original pattern? I'm only extending them into the seam allowance perpendicular to the edge of the seam allowance on the outside. And the notch will be about 1/4 of an inch wide. And I put a little cross mark just to show where the scissor will stop the snipping. This is a vertical notch that goes down that seam. So it's only about 1/4 of an inch long. And then across the shoulders, very short notches. There's a center front notch, and I just wanted to show on both sides, so I'm putting it right against the edge on both sides. Always there's a center front notch. Simply cutting the pattern out. Now what I'm doing is replacing the pins so that the original half pattern remains on top of the new pattern paper. It's good to have it as a reference, and being pinned down, I can take it off at any time without any problem. Now I'm going to mark the center front line onto the new full pattern underneath the original. And transfer all markings to the other side of the pattern. Writing the seam allowance amount inside the seam allowance. Fold your pattern in half and transfer all notch marks. Usually you can see through the tracing paper to where the marks are on the other side. Transferring the bust, waist, and hip lines to the other side of the paper. Always write the amount of pieces that will be cut. There will be one center front piece cut, and it will be interlined with cotton batiste. And moving on to the side front piece. Add seam allowance just as you did for the front piece. Adjoining seams will have the same amount of seam allowance. You can see if I continue, that point at the top will be much longer than any other seam allowances. So we will in a moment determine where to stop that top point. Extending the notch perpendicular to the very outside edge of the new pattern. Now I'm laying the two patterns together. See, I'm comparing the notches and I'm putting the seam, not the seam allowance, I'm overlapping the two seam lines together to see exactly where I want the top of this new seam allowance to end. This will take a little practice. Notch at the side seam, 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the pattern. Since it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I can only go down about 1/8 of an inch for the actual red notch. There's a notch at the waist, so I want to extend that. It's a good idea just to check your pattern very carefully, make sure you have extended all notches and transferred all markings. And we'll cut this piece out. When developing this pattern, this side piece automatically has a little bit of ease in the bust area. When we fit the model with the muslin top, we'll determine if it's enough ease or too much, and we'll adjust the pattern accordingly. Clearly, I did not add any seam allowance to the bottom of this pattern, which is fine. It's probably a little bit longer than it needs to be. So after I am sure of the fit, then I'll go back and make sure there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance that will coordinate with the hem facing. Right now I'm just checking to make sure all my notches are drawn in and coordinate. And you can see that curve is going to be a little bit bigger than what it is sewn to, but it's probably maybe 3/8 total between the two outer edges notches, not the center notch. We will be cutting 2 pieces for the side front in the fabric. On to the back piece. This particular top will have a zipper up the back, so we will not make a full back piece. We will only have the half back as we do here, but we will add seam allowance. This original pattern has no seam allowance down center back, so what I'm doing now is making sure there's enough pattern paper for the length and also for the width. And the first thing I will do is draw my 1-inch center back seam and align the pattern to that 1-inch mark. One-inch extension or seam allowance. Marking center back and putting an arrow right to the exact center back line. Pin your pattern down, allowing room for seam allowance at the top and bottom if applicable. Adding seam allowance as we did to the front pieces. On either side leg of the dart, you place your ruler against that leg and follow it up to the edge of the pattern to create your notch. A right angle from the shoulder seam to the neck seam. And to the outside armhole seam. A right angle from the armhole going down the curved side back seam. Transferring the notches. What I did was align it with the middle line of the ruler and follow that line straight out into the seam allowance, and the notch will be perpendicular to the outer edge of the paper pattern. A notch at the top of the seam allowance on the curved seam, at the shoulders, and its center back neck. Filling in the seam allowance amount. The last piece to have seam allowance added will be the side back piece. Here I am laying the side front on top of the side back just to make sure all the links are exactly the same in the seam allowances and that they align correctly. For the top point here, I went above the top point of the original pattern, the amount that the seam allowance is on that curved seam. So I went above it 3/8 of an inch on this specific pattern and then squared it off. Filling all the notches in, the side, or that's the side seam. And then at the waist there was a notch. Remember that notches not only show the amount of seam allowance, if they're at the top of the seam or on the shoulders, they show the direction the seam is sewn. Determining where that notch will end on the outer edge, aligning it with the inner edge notch, and now it's perpendicular to the outer edge. Checking notches. Writing the amount of the seam allowance inside the seam allowance. The side front will also say cut 2. The side and the center back will say cut 2. So let's take a look at all 4 pieces of our finished pattern, ready to cut muslin and fit the model. A few more notches need to be drawn in. And here is our pattern. One full front, which is cut 1, and all the other 3 pieces are cut 2.